Hello, this is Keith Johnson, and welcome to the Intentional Endowments and Sustainable Financial Markets webinar. We're going to just wait another minute or so until we start to give people a chance to sign on. Okay, let's get started. This is the transitioning to integration of mission with investment practices webinar being sponsored by the Intentional Endowments Network and the Network for Sustainable Financial Markets. And we would like to thank both of the organizations for helping to pull this webinar together. If you could go to the next slide, we are we have a couple of presenters today who are experienced practitioners in this area. Claire Miller is president of the Heron Foundation, and she's also on several boards, including the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, the R.S. Clark Foundation, and she's a member of the U.S. Advisory Committee or Commission to the G8 on Impact Investing, and is on the Social Investment Committee at the Kresge Foundation, the Financial Accounting Standards Board nonprofit advisory committee. David Denman is a trust where he chairs the Finance and Investment Committees. He's also on the Intentional Endowments Network steering executive committees and serves as the Chief Financial Officer at SOMAS Private in the San Francisco area. This is Keith Johnson, and I'm chair of Reinhardt Institutional Investor Service, formerly the general counsel at the State of Wisconsin Investment Board, which is one of the top 10 public funds. As an FYI, the webinar today is being recorded, and it will be posted on the IEN website with intentionalendowments.org. That's all one word. And the presenters will first provide their story approach integration of investment with mission today, and then we will have time for some audience questions in the webinar. So save your questions, and we look forward to getting those. Next slide, please. Let me just quickly set the stage here, because like other institutional investors, foundations and endowments are subject to fiduciary duty when they're investing their assets. And like other institutional investor fiduciaries, they have a duty of care, which is essentially to avoid, intended to help to protect from incompetence, and a duty of loyalty, self-dealing, and requires investing to achieve the organization's purpose. But for philanthropic organizations, so what's called a duty of obedience to mission. The intent there is basically just to recognize that as a charitable organization, they are not an investment manager with an organization attached, but the nonprofit entity must serve the public benefit, subsidizing them through their tax exemption, and the investment function should be aligned with that. So I think Heron is probably much more sophisticated than most philanthropic organizations in understanding their duty of obedience. They have expressed it, rightly so, as a duty to obey the specific mission and an obligation to serve public purposes. So with that duty of obedience as their guide star, Heron has embarked on a journey to change how they are doing their investment management function. So if we could go to the next slide, I'd like to ask Clara Miller from Heron to tell us about how Heron came to focus on integrating mission into investment activities of the organization.
Great, and introduction. Very, it's nice to hear somebody else say it. It's terrific. Those who are not familiar with the Heron Foundation, we were founded in 1992 with a mission to help communities themselves out of poverty. We're about a $280 million foundation, so we like to say, you know, we have ambition to change the economy or help the poor. We're a rounding error on a rounding error in the New York City economy, probably. So we have to think outside our own walls in many ways. And long before I came, I've been at Heron 5 years. Long before I came, Heron was a leader in essentially asking the question, wait a minute, can't we do a little more than provide our excess cash flow as required by law, you know, every year in grants to nonprofits? Isn't there some fundamental we can change the way we do our work? And so by the time I arrived in 2011, about 40% of the endowment, the permanent capital of the Heron Foundation, were aligned with a mission, with its mission. And when it came, as you know, as foundation presidents are wont to do, we did some strategic planning, we did some navel gazing. More importantly, we kind of looked back and said to ourselves, gosh, you know, we had a lot of really good programs and great people doing work on the front lines, and their approach, like many of us and many of our allies, was this kind of confidence, access to assets, access to credit, access to training would lead dependably for a family or a willing worker who lead dependably to a job and to a ladder up and to an economy that is going to be helping in some way. And we had to admit that that actually hadn't been true for a long time. And that was that after the financial crash, a lot of the kinds of things, you know, home ownership and a lot of the things we'd advocated for in the sense of reliable jobs and income for people ended up being actually in some ways harmful. And the financial crisis led to the largest stripping of assets from the poor in American history. And most of those people were African Americans, Latinos, and Asians. You know, and so we really had to say to ourselves, it's not enough to think of it as a mobile activity. If we really want to change the nature of the economy so that it's welcoming in the way we imagine it to be, we've got to deploy all of our assets. So that led us to really say to ourselves, gosh, the conventional model of the foundation, assets and investments, even if they're kind of are on one side and they can exist in kind of, you know, profits at any cost, rough and tumble world of capitalism, and this kind of happy world of making grants to nonprofit organizations to kind of clean up the mess. This is a work. It hasn't worked for what we wanted to do. And so, in a sense, we had to say we have to change the nature of what we do. We have to change our business model as a foundation and tear down the wall between investing and grant making so that we're focused on deploying capital for the public good and in particular for the mission we have. We have to embrace a much broader reckoning of risk and return so that we're looking not only at our own financial risk, but mission performance risk, and we're looking at and ultimately we're looking at just go away, it just gets shed. And so we have to, we felt we had to think much more broadly about risk. And in the process of doing this, we transitioned to be a unified staff team. Now, that doesn't mean everybody had it's not like that, but it's just that everybody is kind of pulling in the same direction. There's not this very strict people who have to make 5% real come hell or high water and whose compensation is based on the return of the portfolio. Chief Investment Officer on the one hand, and then subject to experts who are not cognizant about money or markets or anything else, which is the conventional foundation model. So we changed. We started a process which is now basically for 2017 to align all of our assets for mission, to unify our staff and business model radically, and to think of ourselves as a very different kind of organization. Now, in the process of doing that, we start out by saying to ourselves, well, what do we own? Let's figure out what we actually own. And in order to do that, it's very typical that you really only look at the portfolio from the point of view of asset class. We decided we needed to not only look at asset class, that's useful, but also to take the enterprise view, meaning, where is this impact? How are the holdings, the actual enterprise holdings in our portfolio, having an impact on helping people and communities help themselves? Do they support the mission? Do they undermine the mission? Are they kind of neutral? And how do you think broadly about the contribution from society of each of these enterprises and of these enterprises collectively? So next slide, please. Can you just change the slide? This slide is entitled Heron's Challenge to Peers. I think to peers. So as I said when I started this presentation, Heron has, maybe on a good day even 300 million in assets. But even if you every foundation in the United States, the Gates Foundation, all the Buffett money, MacArthur, Ford, huge foundations, and we all emptied our endowments. It would be about 14 months of the U.S. school budget. It's less than 1% of assets under management. So, let's say we spend even if we converted all of our endowments to mission investing, they're positive for each organization individually. But if we really want to move the market and we want to make a different kind of create a revolution of capital, as it were, we have to think of ourselves as acting together. We can't, creating a lot of sort of small self-actualizing investment institutions won't get us where we need to go as far as improving today. And so for all foundations, I think, and for Heron made this decision way back, investment is ways an influence strategy as much as it is a strategy to provide financial sustenance in its lifetime. So both of those things are very, very central to our strategy. Not only are we talking about all of our assets being for mission, but we also want to influence the other investors and other enterprises to think of their role in the economy broadly, long term. One of the things that, and in fact, you know, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, as well as colleges and universities, who are starting down this path or who have been down this path for a long time. That's amazingly enough, now you have, you know, BlackRock and Bain Capital and a whole range of other non-typical ESG and environmental, social, and governance players kind of jumping into the market. So that then makes this is a real opportunity to change the nature of the market. One of those opportunities is actually making public companies report into the market, and this is just only focusing on that part of our portfolio. We have a imaginable legal form of organization, cooperatives, nonprofits, you name it, they're all in the portfolio. Focus on public companies for a moment. There are not right now the standards for public company reporting on 10Ks on environmental, social, and governance data points. And so we thought that was very integrity of this idea that you can actually have impact and have kind of returns, as it were, or mission performance at any rate, as an investor. So that's we're working with a group of others. The idea of making sure that we create kind of a simplistic market, I think, through modeling certain kinds of documentation and policies, and also really take seriously the heft and the importance of those who as people who can articulate the long-term vision and support the managers who want to and proxy voting is one version of that. When I say take the long-term view, one of the things we've, you know, is well things and, you know, thinking about things so much that, you know, you want to scream, but in some way, what we're talking about is good management of good businesses that who take the long-term view, and taking long-term in many cases is good management, and we want to be an investor who can also take that long-term view. You treat your employees decently. The long-term view means you don't, you know, kind of environment for everybody. It means you honor the kind of legal institutions of the nation and the tax laws. So, you know, that's our idealistic view of what we're trying to do. And of course, once you get of asset mission, as I've said before, it's a kind of a false, it's a false summit in a way. First of all, of course, it's hopefully more effective than using only 5% of one's spend for mission goals, because that implies, you know, there are these two economies, as I described before. But you really have to say, if you just manage your 100%, first of all, you have to optimize it constantly. Mission, you know, you can have companies can be be positive one year, the other on kind of mission metrics, just like they can on financial metrics. Figuring out just how to manage those together has been really a challenge, but an exciting one. There's lots of people working on it very hard, and people much smarter than we are. So at any rate, I will end there and just say at the bottom of really was the idea that if our goal is to help people and communities help themselves out of poverty, it's simply more realistic. 100% of our assets rather than 5%.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sure. But next slide, please. And let's turn it over to David. David, as you're the chair of investment at Hampshire and have extensive background experience investments and finance during your career. So how compared to an academic institution like Hampshire College?
First of all, thank you, Keith, and for attending. As I was listening to the presentation from Heron, it struck me that their approach is in some ways quite similar to ours, but in other as an institution, is really about educating people and about thought leadership. So we're not about particularly applying things to try to change the world. We're trying to empower people to think about what they can do in the world along the lines of what our approach is to education. Next slide, please. On Hampshire. Hampshire was formed in 1970. It's the brainchild of the other four colleges in the Pioneer Valley, Massachusetts, Smith, Mount Holyoke, and University of Massachusetts. Hampshire was founded as what they call an experimenting college and has a very unique, interesting. A lot of it is community involved. A lot of it revolves around social justice, and it's also quite shamelessly promoting the college. While we teach only one business class, we were ranked by Fortune as one of the top 5 schools. Large portion of how we approach education, and we also are in the top 20 among schools for kids that go on and get their terminal degree in their field of study. Socially progressive since its inception. This is just sort of part of its DNA. So this kind of an investment policy is really very consistent with how it operates today. And as I've been on the board now for just over 7 years, my thinking about this has evolved. That integration, that the investment policy is very consistent with what the college does and how the college operates, is really critical. Both kind of alignment with mission that Keith talked about earlier, and that the endowment is and should be used as a mechanism for pursuing the college and further its goals and objectives really as broadly as possible. Just a sort of a footnote on background, and I'll ask you to change the slide. Small endowment, we're under $50 million. So one of the things that happens that I think is likely a bit different than you might see with Heron or some of the bigger endowments is the money we invest is done through managers, not particularly picking particular issues. So that creates its own set of challenges, and at the same time, it also has forced us to up our game in terms of how we think about this, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Next slide, please. We went through a fairly extensive exercise in 2011 to update our policy. What my predecessor on the board time had determined was that we really had sort of a mishmash of things, and he really went through a fairly extensive exercise to make it, to really align it about and we will disfavor those that don't. it's and one of the challenges that we've had become available to how we think about things, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a sec. Because we want to encourage all the people in the community to and within the college's infrastructure that has a specific of the Hampshire community are with regard to its investment policy. It's called QUIRE. The community at Hampshire on investment responsibility. Again, engaged with you might be active about shocked at how little we've gotten in the way of push from people, because we really have been sort of very well at the same time using that as a way to engage the students about how they think about that. Next slide, please. We have spent a lot of time talking about thinking about how do we do this. Again, being mindful of that. Who are the managers? What are their imperatives? And being very clear with them about what our policy is. Where 5-6 years we've brought our carbon exposure down from about 350 basis to take it down so we add or about zero on who's quite progressive and quite thoughtful, whose view is that natural gas is an important transitional fuel for changing the economy towards a more environmentally responsive and thoughtful economy. As a result, they help on the list. Your way of kind of chemicals that might come out of them, but are also locally sourced. So again, there's a fairly significant effort here to align what we do operationally, how we operate with regard to the endowments. We also have to be mindful of the fact that given Hampshire's reliance on monies coming from the endowment to support the educational mission, that we cannot sacrifice returns. And in my period on the board, we have been consistently at or above all of the various indices and, that are the standards by which the endowment returns are measured. A lot of that has to do with the fact that I think we've done a pretty good job on picking managers, and one in particular has been just an absolute rock star for us. So overall, our returns have been quite solid. But that's more a function of the stock pickers than it is any sort of impact that ESG investing has certainly and potentially positively. Interestingly, there was the cover story in this most recent issue of Barron's talks about how emergence in the investment world of this kind of manager, and a lot of them don't talk about themselves in ESG terms. They talk about themselves in terms of buying sustainable businesses, which is very consistent with what the Heron presentation talked about picking companies that save money because they use less water, or because they don't have labor disruptions with their employees, because they treat their employees well. So there's an interesting shift going on in the world. This again aligns with our thinking about this and how we should be operating if we're thoughtful about how we are as an investor. There's a fair that occurs with regard to thinking about that in ESG ways, because that's ultimately about sustainability. And as I've said, so we think it's important to align the academic mission. Next slide, please. As I suggested earlier, about how we operate. Not only do we look down towards our community, but we also obviously have an outside investment advisor who's actually been quite helpful and thoughtful to us, providing us with options in terms of how we think about doing proper asset allocation. One of the things that's become increasingly important to us, is important to the Hampshire community, is that we, about 2 years ago, committed to the community that we would be fully transparent on what we own. That's fairly sort of typical commingled fund on the long side and equities and debt issues. But it gets more complicated when you think about hedge funds. Our hedge funds are generally, again, because we're a fairly small endowment, are in fund of funds. So what we've done is we've pushed on the managers to give us transparency, and we're getting increasingly better transparency with those managers, both at the fund of funds levels and then at the principal. Report that out to the community. Hampshire being Hampshire, the students have been very much on our case at not being really transparent, getting that kind of transparency with the hedge funds. But we think that that is absolutely critical issue, both in terms of policy and from the standpoint of holding yourself accountable to your constituents in terms of how you do that. That's a hot issue for a lot of folks. My sense is the curve on that, but personally, I think that's a really important thing to do. We also, as I said, we this to get their views about particular issues. Over the last 18 months, we've had a number of go-rounds with the group, the equivalent of the Black Lives Matter group, which first pushed us to make sure that their first ask was that we not be invested in prisons, as that's a structure for institutional racism. We assured them that not only were we not in the 4 companies that we identified, we also weren't invested in, but that wasn't enough for them. They wanted us to call out that Hampshire was not treated as a particularly favored industry in our policy. We frankly resisted that a bit because we didn't want to get into the issues du jour, kind of more policy and principles driven. But we ultimately reached a compromise where we pulled any sort of specific industries out of our policy and now have a sort of a very short working list. It's 3 industries where we say these are particularly disfavored industries, but we left it at the discretion of the committee about taking those on, putting those off, and not having them was to say, well, really, what might be more interesting for you is to do some corporate advocacy and get in front of Whole Foods as a shareholder and say to them, gee, you might want to look at this. So there's that kind of interplay, which is important because it creates an opportunity to have our students being more effective actors in the world about how they look to change the world through investment. That's a really important part of what we do. And again, that in my mind helps us use the endowment as an educational tool. And I also want to, and just a last point on this, I want to echo one of the comments that I think is a real challenge is the lack of standards consistent with otherwise how to measure this makes measuring these impacts rather difficult. It's something that we're struggling with, we're wrestling with, we try to get better. Again, I think we're fairly far ahead of the curve on that, so that's something that's an emergent issue. Next slide, please.
So, well, thank you very much, David. It's really interesting to me that both Hampshire and the Heron Foundation have thought a lot about how they're approaching their investment programs and have a very comprehensive viewpoint on integrating investment with mission and public policy. So we've got some time for questions from participants. If you would like to ask a question, we're not taking them on the phone. Please type your question into the chat box on the lower right-hand side of the screen and hit send, and that will send the question to us, hopefully. And we'll tee up the questions and as many as we can. While we're waiting for people to type their questions, I have a couple. I'm curious, what you've done is, to a certain extent, a different kind of way of looking at investments, but with using the same tools that other investors do. Having advisors and even investment staff that had the capacity to implement an integrated approach to mission and investment. How did you approach finding advisors and staff people? Clara, you want to start first?
Sure. I can say that when Heron started, long before I came on the scene, which was at least 5 years before I came on the scene, there were very few to none seasoned managers in the field. There were a couple of private equity firms starting to emerge, like DBL and others that I'm sure folks are familiar with. But it was really, I think, for Reagan, were really the pioneers here at Heron. It was tough to find. These days, there's lots of people starting to get into the act, and I think the challenge is twofold. One of them is that our experience with organizations that aren't built for purpose. That is, for example, Bain, which has a very interesting fund it's putting up to kind of mid-sized industrial companies in the U.S. and not dismantle them, but to help them become more sustainable. And that's a very compelling opportunity for us. At the same time, we're kind of gun shy because we've had some experience with funds that have been grafted onto an idealistic person in a conventional investment firm. When times got tough, they didn't manage through it. They tended to, start doing things that so much mission aligned, you can say. That said, there are some really interesting. There's a real explosion, I think, of firms and advisors out there, and the real key is making sure that they're seasoned enough, and also, interestingly enough, that they themselves have enough growth capital to be sustainable and to thrive. So it's been an exciting challenge for us to find. We're doing so. Very good.
Our experience, we've had some pretty luck. Our investment advisor, when I first started working, the partner at the firm was engaged and got lucky. One of his subordinates who worked with really began to work very closely with us, and she got it. And she has actually been fairly strong in helping move her firm along to be more aligned with this and talk about it with us, but on a more broad-based basis. So I think a lot of it is about finding a particular person and W is about who works for who. That these folks work for you as your advisor, and that it's incumbent on you to highlight the importance of this and have it be clear that this is something that matters. And I would echo Clara's comments here that particularly among the advisors like Cambridge and the like, where people are being more thoughtful about it, they're being more intentional about moving and strengthening their capabilities to be able to advise in this way.
One thing that I didn't mention, early grant it made was to Cambridge to get it to create an impact investment division, and been a customer of Cambridge for years, and for a while they didn't have much, now they do. It's a great thing. It's a really good thing.
Okay, we've got some questions coming in. Explain what, if any, engagement efforts you've undertaken with any public companies, or do you leave students? And will you support any resolutions that they might file?
A reminder that because we really invest through managers, we're not shareholders per se. We have gotten support from our managers who said, you know, if you have students who want to do work with us on these things, we'd love that. So there's a degree of attenuation, but again, we sort of push it up towards the managers, and have gotten generally some support on that. And the managers view this as a way that they're aligned with our mission about it. They think that what we're doing is really wonderful. We think it's important that any sort of initiative from the students what the college's policy is about. The driver for the changes that occurred in 2011 were that used the campus at Hampshire for a conference called Students for Justice in Palestine, and they actually announced to the world that Hampshire had divested from Israel. In fact, that wasn't true, and it wasn't consistent either with the old or the new policy that we would do so. So we on I'll call it, we're the gating event about this for particular student initiatives, but we are generally supportive of this. And if it's something that the college supports and the investment committee and the board would get behind, we would absolutely support that. If it's not, we need to be able to pursue that themselves so that they learn from the experience, which is again consistent with our mission.
The second question applies to you too. Does Heron sponsor any shareholder resolutions? That aspect.
This is, I mean, we are really interested in this question of and thus far we're generally focusing. We're coming down on the engaged side, and I can tell you an anecdote that's relevant, I think, to Hampshire's experience as well, which is that when we started out, we were kind of saying, oh, for people who are in poverty, we want to find employment effects, but we understand we need to find some real estate exposures in our portfolio, and we were looking at public company real estate investment trusts, or REITs as they're sometimes called, and looking at it, we got a Bloomberg terminal, so we were looking on our Bloomberg terminal at what are the biggest employers, who are the biggest employers who have REITs. And there was one in particular, one or two, but one in particular that was just had, you know, 2 employees than anybody else. I mean, they were just huge. So we went in, and of course, when we went in, we found that it was Corrections Corporation. So, you know, this created a dilemma. But at any rate, we were sort of saying to ourselves, well, we probably should get out of that. This is an organization that helps communities help themselves out of poverty. And I wrote a blog post about it that went on the Huffington Post. And what happened was that then Huffington Post got a call from the general counsel of retract statement. Those are not all, those are not prisoners, those employees. Those are actually employees. A dialogue between us, so because we told Huffington Post, well, we stand by our statement. We read the 10K. It doesn't, it seems to us that these guys could be prisoners. I mean, they have contracts from the federal government, and they're, and so on and so forth. So there ensued dialogue about it. I'm only saying that because I really think that there's a real opportunity here to say, how can we constructive owner, in addition to just sending a signal of divestment, which I think is a very strong and important as well. But are there ways that we can engage with, what seems like, the absolute worst thing on earth, which is the private prison system that were articulated earlier? So at any rate, long story short, we have divested from private prison. We still are very interested in having some sort of engagement strategy and continuing that, because we have things. So it's much more complex than anybody really wants it to be.
Well, Claire, here's another question for you. One of the audience participants asks, is there any way that smaller foundations, such as the $20 million foundation, could emulate Heron's work? Could we co-invest with you?
Oh, sure. Welcome that conversation. And we did create and are in the process of refreshing something called the USCII, or the U.S. Community Investing Index, which is it's managed by State Street Global, and it's that other foundations can at least sort of invest with us in a fund. But we're in conversation with us, and we really are keen to make common cause across, and not kind of do a very complicated set of conversations and transaction costs. The last thing we want is to increase a lot of costs, increasing impact in the sector. So yes.
Okay. Both of you, can you say more about how the standards for measuring impact investing are coming along, whether through the SEC or the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board or others? Considered leaders in developing these metrics, especially those that show materiality? David, do you want to start with that?
That's a tough question. There's a number of folks that are doing it in the carbon space, but one of the challenges is that this is really, and if, for example, poverty is the particular issue on which you're focused, or human rights is a particular issue on which you're focused, your imperative would be very different than it would be if, say, carbon was your particular issue. So that's a real challenge, and I don't know how it's going to play out, because there's lots of different flavors and colors and emphases in this space. There are some good folks that are doing this, and I'd be happy to sort of get their folks if they'd like. I don't have them on the tip of my tongue at the moment, but it's a real challenge, because this area and that focus points are so diverse that it makes it really hard to have standards that I think are helpful and understandable.
Yeah,
Clara, you've been doing that's been an effort that you're. How's it?
There's a lot of different pieces of it, and David is spot on when he says it's complicated. It's complicated too. the SASB effort is actually getting very promising. It's about data standards, so not really about interpretation or ratings or analysis or any of those second steps that sort of say so what. It's really about how do you report on material items that are non-financial, in this case environmental, social, and governance standards. They've done those standards for 79 industries, as we do for those industries for financial reporting, and that was only in 1973. It's easy to forget. That was relatively recent. And so the SEC has become so interested in what SASB has done that they're actually asking questions about governance, saying it needs to separate the fundraising from the standard setting and a variety of other things that the Fed's set up. So that's quite encouraging. Then when you get to the question of, okay, so you got these standards and they're material, meaning they pose their information or data pose material risk to investors, and therefore under SEC rules they have to be disclosed. Then you say, well, how does that then play into kind of impact investing and what we're talking about? It's definitely related, but it's a little different. And Heron is working itself and with a variety of others, and yes, Carbon CDP, members of organizations that are doing amazing work on this. It's almost like a little bit of a data jungle or a data scrum in a sense, but I think good thing out of it. But we're thinking in terms of net contribution framework rather than kind of saying a company is good or bad. We're looking at the net contribution of a whole range of pieces of its operation to the world. And we're saying then go up and down over time. I think that's something people often forget. They think, okay, well, Volkswagen, it's a really good company. Social investors, but gee, they had a governance issue that nobody really flagged. And there's a lot of examples of that. So to David's point, it's a developing scrum. We're making real progress, and little by little, a lot of machine reading data, stuff that BlackRock is doing, very interesting, beyond straight self-reported data from companies, is starting to bubble up too.
Brock, we've got a question about what are the most effective levers to get larger institutional investors into and focused on impact investing? Who'd like to take that?
Well, I think that actually David said something, who works for who? I mean, it's customers and customers. One of the things that's been driving the BlackRocks and the big asset managers are, of course, the people who are their customers. And increasingly, those are younger people, in many cases, people who inherit wealth and telling their asset managers, we want to invest for a better world. We don't want to just invest in an era of climate change that's just not as meaningful as maybe it once was. So they're being pushed by their customers, and they're kind of, I think, running around looking for product. It's a little bit worrying if you're, because it's both exciting because, here are this new customer group that's demanding, but it means also that there's a potential for greenwashing or impact washing, which is why there's so much stress on metrics and accounting and such. But yeah, I think it's the customers, and that could be funds too.
I would echo that as well, adding the comment that we're already seeing some fairly significant activity in this regard, and some of the bigger funds, CalPERS and STRS have clearly moved in this direction. There's a fascinating piece on CNBC the day after Superstorm Sandy hit New York. Had two people. One was the president of the Southern Company, who disavowed any sort of impact of climate change, and the other was Tom DiNapoli, who runs the fund, who said this absolutely will affect what we're going to do in two ways. First of all, we have to invest in our infrastructure. Second, it's going to affect how we invest. So there's a groundswell happening here that I think is very real. The Barron's story that I referenced earlier really speaks to an emergent thing in the investment world that says, if we invest in companies that are smart and thoughtful about how they use resource, and resource broadly defined, including humans, we will get better returns. And that is going to, I think is going to be really critical in this, because I think it really wakes up the idea that you pay a price for doing this kind of investing.
Well, we've got time for just one more question, and this one relates to fiduciary responsibility. In the minds of some of those who wield the fiduciary responsibility banner as strictly meaning to make the highest return possible, you seem to be using your own definition of fiduciary responsibility. What avenues of legal support have you utilized to justify this broader definition that you're using?
I'll take that one, Keith, if you don't mind. There's actually a lot of legal support around this. The Uniform Law Institute, which is the group that proffers out consistent law for states to adopt, and who are the principal drivers behind things like laws governing investments by foundation endowments, supports this as a part of the underlying thinking and premises for profits particularly. I also frankly think that it's an absolute misnomer to say that we're not going to consider politics everything. So it's a way, in a way, it's a way to justify looking solely at returns. Investment there's a shift going on. Again, we're going to refer back to the Barron's article. The idea of loyalty responsibility is, what fiduciary responsibility requires is two things. And this is all basic black letter law. One is institution's interests first, and three, in the not-for-profit area, there's a lot of support by virtue of the fact that you are being given the benefit of not having to pay tax on most of your activities, excluding unrelated tax, that there's an additional requirement, which is that you be loyal to the mission of the institution.
Thank you, David. I'd add to that the Internal Revenue Service Department has recently provided guidance to foundations, private foundations, around make investments that are aligned with mission as being within fiduciary responsibility. As well as for pension funds, the Department of Labor has an interpretive bulletin out, basically, which recognizes that ESG often are financially material or material to risk, and can appropriately be taken. Well, I think we've reached the end of our time, and I would like to thank Clara David, Network and Network for Sustainable Financial Markets for putting on this webinar. The webinar recording will be available on the Intentional Endowments website, along with some material you might find helpful from the Heron Foundation. And the materials, I think, will be sent as follow-up to all folks that registered for the webinar. Thank you to all of those who joined us. We hope this was helpful. And hope you have a nice day. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Keith.
Thank you.